He accused me of stealing and my family kicked me out. Years later, I became warden, and I saw him in his cell. Why did he do it? What did I say to him? And which one of us was the real prisoner? Subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I always woke up before the alarm, not because I didn't trust it, but because my body no longer needed permission. Years in the military turned the body into a clock and the mind into a ledger. By the time the digits blinked 5:00 on the nightstand, I was already up, sitting at the edge of the bed, rubbing my wrists like they ached for shackles. Outside the window, the Mississippi sky was still dark, a washed-out kind of black that promised little and demanded nothing. The house was silent, neat. My boots stood where I'd left them the night before, lined perfectly against the wall next to the bench I'd built with my own hands the year I left the service. I brewed coffee the same way every morning, 2 scoops, no sugar, no cream, just heat and bitterness. I drank it standing by the window, looking out at the gravel drive that led nowhere. Nothing ever happened on that road, and still, I watched it every morning like it might betray me. Routine was a language I spoke fluently. Iron shirts, laced boots, gunmetal belt buckled tight. No noise, no excess. The walls of my house were empty, save for a single photo of my platoon in Fallujah tucked behind the hallway door. No family pictures, no frames of childhood. What little of that remained was locked in a metal box under my bed, beside the discharge papers and the folded flag from my father's casket. By 6, I was in the truck. The drive to the penitentiary took 40 minutes if the back roads were clear, and they always were. I liked the silence of those drives. No radio, no distractions, just the hum of tires and the occasional hawk circling above the trees. Most men feared stillness. I craved it. North Grove Penitentiary sat like a tumor on the edge of the county, brick and steel, encased in barbed wire, and surrounded by nothing but flat fields and forgotten gravel. It had been my post for 7 years, first as head of internal security, then as warden. They promoted me not because I asked, but because I never bent. I enforced rules the way the military taught me, without interpretation. That morning began like any other. I passed through the double gates, flashed my badge, nodded to Grant in the control booth. The staff changed faces sometimes, but I didn't. I was the fixed point in a system of rotation. My office was spare. Steel desk, state-issued chair, 2 locked cabinets, 1 window with a view of the inner yard. I set my coffee down and reached for the daily intake list. Mondays were heavy. Transfers came in from other facilities across the state. Names, numbers, charges, medical records. The list was thick, the paper slightly curled at the edges. I flipped through it, eyes scanning for protocol issues, repeat offenders, known agitators, psychological flags. Page after page, it was all rote. Then I saw the name. Inmate 478281. Alexander M. Bennett. The coffee cooled in my hand, untouched. My stomach clenched, not from surprise, but from the clarity of the moment. There it was, in black ink. My brother's name, listed among men who'd stolen, stabbed, raped. I reread it 3 times. There was no middle initial mistake, no clerical error. It was him. 10 years. That's how long it had been since I'd seen him. 10 years since that funeral. Since the day our mother was lowered into the ground and he spat poison through his teeth, blaming me for everything. For the money, for the silence, for not being there when she died. I remembered the crowd of relatives, the stale church air, the taste of earth on my tongue when I stood in my best suit, not saying a word while he accused me in front of everyone. "You stole everything." That's what he shouted, loud enough for even the pastor to pause. I didn't answer then, just like I didn't answer now. My fingers gripped the paper tighter than necessary. I could see the block assignment line. He had been designated for Unit C, medium security, no known gang affiliations. Charge, financial fraud, obstruction, illegal gambling debts, resisting arrest. Sentence, 6 years, with a possible parole review in 3. Of course it was gambling. That was always his weakness. He called it risk calculus when we were younger. Played cards like they were scripture, lied to himself like it was a sacrament. I knew, even when we were kids, that Alex would either win big or lose everything. He was the kind of man who never saw a cliff he didn't want to jump from, just to see if he'd fly. I closed the file and placed it face down on the desk. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the air had thickened. Outside, 2 guards led a chain gang through the courtyard. The wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the concrete. I didn't tell anyone, not the deputies, not the intake clerks, not even Sergeant Harville, who ran scheduling for the blocks. I assigned Alex's processing to a junior officer and made a note in the system to keep him off my direct rotation. No special privileges, no contact orders, no exceptions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with my arms across my chest, staring at the ceiling. The fan spun slowly above me, slicing the silence into even segments. I thought about our mother, her hands, her voice, the way she used to set 2 plates at dinner, even when Dad worked late. She never played favorites, but I always knew she worried about Alex more. He was the dreamer, the artist, the one who wanted to move to California and paint murals on city walls. I was the one who stayed behind, took care of the house, enlisted. She used to say, "Clay, your brother's got a wild heart. You just make sure it doesn't burn him." He burned anyway. When Dad died, the inheritance wasn't much. A pension, some savings, a rusting truck. I handled the paperwork. I was always the one who handled things. But Alex thought I cheated him, thought I siphoned off what little we had, thought I stole what he lost at a blackjack table in Biloxi. I didn't argue then, and I wouldn't argue now. The next morning, I went in early. The sky was the same dull gray. The smell of industrial cleaner hung in the corridors like disinfected guilt. I passed Unit C without looking. I didn't pause when the steel doors slammed behind me. But in my head, I heard her voice, "Promise me, Clay, no matter what, don't turn your back on him. He's still your brother." I'd promised. And I had meant it. But I never thought it would be tested like this. Not through bars. Not behind a uniform. Not with his name on my ledger. Still, I kept reading the list. Names and numbers, men and files. But that one name had seared itself into the page like a scorch mark. And I knew then, as I traced my finger along the edge of that folder, that the war wasn't over. It had only changed uniforms. The next days passed in a blur. I worked harder than usual, double-checked logs, ran inspections twice. I buried myself in numbers and gates and routines. The officers didn't question it. They were used to my silences. Some said I was too hard, too cold, but better a cold warden than a careless one. I didn't see Alex in those first days. I avoided the unit when I could, but I could feel him there, like a bruise under the skin. I knew that eventually he'd find a way to speak, to force my hand. But until then, I waited, like I had for 10 years, in silence. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of day where the humidity clings to your skin like old guilt. The air inside the penitentiary was heavy, too thick for March. A thunderstorm had passed in the early morning, leaving behind puddles in the courtyard and the sharp smell of wet concrete. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered more than usual, and the intercom crackled like it had something to say but never quite dared. I stood in the central corridor of Unit C, clipboard in hand, reading through repair orders, when I heard the familiar sound of new boots. Not the soft shuffle of someone beaten by routine, but the cocky gait of someone trying to own the space. I didn't look up at first. I didn't need to. I recognized the rhythm of that walk before I saw the man. Well, I'll be damned. The voice was unmistakable, a little rougher than I remembered, but still laced with that same grin I used to hear across dinner tables and pool halls. Clayton Bennett in the flesh. I figured if I ever saw you again, it'd be through a lawyer. I looked up. There he was, in the same orange jumpsuit as everyone else, but standing like he wore silk. Alexander had always carried himself like the room owed him attention, and time hadn't stripped him of that habit. His face was leaner, the jaw more pronounced, and his left eye carried a faint scar I didn't recognize. But the eyes were the same, cunning and restless. I didn't speak. I kept my pen poised against the clipboard, finished noting a cracked tile, then turned to walk. He followed. "You're not even going to say hello? After all this time?" His tone wasn't angry. It was amused, like we were kids again and I'd just refused to share a toy. I reached the end of the hall and stopped. I didn't turn around. "Keep walking, inmate," I said flatly. He laughed, loud enough for it to echo. "That's how we're playing it? You, the tin soldier, me, the criminal. Guess the uniforms fit, huh?" I walked away. Behind me, I heard him say, softer this time, "They gave you exactly what you always wanted, Clay, control." He was wrong. I hadn't wanted control. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. But the world didn't care what I wanted. The staff picked up on it within a day. They saw the way my eyes narrowed when Unit C was mentioned, the way I stayed away from morning checks in that block. Harvell asked once if something was off. "You seem tense lately," he said over lunch in the break room. "That new guy in C giving you trouble?" I shook my head. "Nothing I can't handle." But even I knew that wasn't true. Alex made himself known. He was charming, funny, manipulative, the kind of inmate who knew how to make himself likable to the guards without seeming desperate. He volunteered for chores, quoted scripture during chapel, played chess with the older lifers. But underneath it, I could feel the needle, the quiet pricking of someone who was just waiting to tear the wound wide open. He provoked me in small ways, a passing comment here, a sideways glance there. Once, during inspection, he saluted me, a mocking gesture. The officers laughed. I didn't react. Another time, he stood in line at meal distribution and called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, warden, tell me something. When you signed those estate papers, did you use Mom's pen or just forge her name too?" The spoon in my hand bent. I set it down and left the cafeteria. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at the blank wall. I didn't drink, never had. But for the first time in years, I wanted to. Not to forget, but to dull the sharp edge of remembering. He was dragging it all back. The funeral, the accusations, the way he'd stood in front of our cousins, holding a stack of forged bank statements he swore proved my guilt. The shouting, the silence after, the doors that closed on me one by one until I was alone. I never defended myself, not because I didn't have the evidence, I did, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. He needed a villain, and I was the only one left in the house. I took the fall for peace, for Mother, for the family that no longer claimed me. Now he was back, behind bars and somehow still holding the match. The chaplain noticed too. James was young, barely 30, full of questions and quiet observations. He'd been at North Grove for a little over a year, but he had a way of listening that made even the hardest men soften. He stopped me one afternoon outside the chapel. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said, "but you and inmate Bennett, there's history there, isn't there?" I looked at him. His eyes were clear, earnest, no malice. Nothing else obvious. You don't flinch often, but with him, it's like he speaks in Morse code and only you hear it. I didn't answer. James waited a moment, then nodded. Sometimes it's the ones closest to us who know exactly where to press. Later that week, I found out James had spoken to Alex. They'd had a long conversation after evening prayers. James didn't tell me what was said, but his face afterward was thoughtful, almost sad. "He's angry," James told me, "but not at you." Not really. That was the problem. Alex was angry at everything. Our father, the world, himself. I'd just been the nearest target. Then came the incident in the showers. I was on routine patrol when the call came through the radio. Fight in C block, shower unit, multiple inmates involved. I was there in minutes. The scene was chaos, water everywhere, 2 men on the ground, one bleeding from the temple. And in the middle of it, Alex, standing, shirtless, fists clenched, blood dripping from a split lip. I pushed through the crowd, barking orders. "Everyone back in cells, now." Officers pulled men apart, locked down the area. I stepped toward Alex. "What happened?" I asked the guard beside him. "Gonzalez jumped him," the officer said. "No warning. Said something about a debt." I looked at Alex. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, grinned. Yes, I made a bad bet. Again. I told the guards to clear the room. I took Alex to the infirmary myself. He sat on the table while the nurse cleaned his lip, silent for once. When she left to get gauze, he looked at me. You came fast, he said. It's my job. No. Your job is to run this place. You didn't have to come here, but you did. I didn't respond. You still protecting me, big brother? That word. Brother. He hadn't used it in a decade. I'm protecting order, I said. He leaned in, voice low. You think if you keep pretending we're strangers, it'll hurt less? I stepped back, the nurse returned, and I left without another word. That night, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was the letter, the last one my mother ever wrote me. I'd kept it sealed for years, unopened. Not because I couldn't read it, but because I didn't deserve to. But I opened it now. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Clay, I know I won't be there much longer, and I know you've carried more than your share. I just want you to remember, Alex is not your enemy. He's your wound, and you don't heal by cutting deeper. Be strong, but be kind. For me, I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the drawer. The next morning, I went to Unit C at dawn. Alex was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall. I stood outside the cell. He looked up. No lectures today, he asked. I shook my head. No. He nodded slowly. For the first time, there was no smirk. We looked at each other through the bars. 10 years of silence between us. And still, somehow, the words hadn't come. But the war had shifted. I could feel it. And neither of us had won. The storm came without warning. That afternoon, the sky had been calm, brushed with the pale gold of early evening. The air hung still and dense, the kind of heat that pushed itself down your throat and coiled at the base of your lungs. Even the inmates were quieter than usual, dragging their feet in the yard, heads lowered under the unforgiving sun. It was the calm I'd grown to distrust, too measured, too silent. Years in combat had taught me one thing above all. When things were too quiet, they never stayed that way for long. By the time I returned to my office after evening rounds, I already knew something was wrong. The power had flickered twice during inspections. Hallway cameras glitched. The static on my radio grew louder, voices cutting in and out like they were being swallowed. I tried the main monitor once more. Unit C was flickering red. Motion sensors were jumping. Then the call came. Code 7, riot alert. Sections B and C, possible electrical interference. Repeat, we have a breach in coordination. Lockdown pending. Warden, advise. My pulse didn't race. It never did. You didn't survive under gunfire by letting your heart take the lead. I stood, clipped on my badge, adjusted my belt, and grabbed the emergency override key from the drawer. By the time I stepped into the hallway, the lights were dimming, casting the block in a sickly orange hue. The siren blared, low and uneven, like a wounded animal. I moved fast, cutting through the maze of concrete and steel, barking orders as I went. Harvell met me by the stairwell. Block C's system just dumped. Security doors aren't responding. They think a circuit blew during diagnostics, he shouted over the alarm. Any guards inside? Parson. He was escorting an inmate through maintenance access, archive wing, old storage. The door locked behind him. We've got no visuals. My stomach tightened. Archive wing. That was the underbelly of the prison. Rarely used, barely lit, narrow as a crawl space. One exit, one way in. And I already knew who the inmate was. Give me a flashlight, I said. Harvell blinked. Sir, protocol says, get me a flashlight and open the manual hatch. That's an order. I could feel his hesitation, but he nodded and ran. Minutes later, I was alone in the passage. The air was thick, damp. The smell of mold and dust and copper wiring filled my nose. My boots echoed against the metal grating. The flashlight beam trembled slightly, though my hands remained steady. I passed 2 storage rooms, both empty. Water leaked from overhead pipes. Somewhere, far above, the alarms kept wailing, disconnected from the silence down here. Then I saw him. Alex sat slumped against the far wall, legs stretched out, head bowed. Blood smeared the side of his temple, and one wrist was raw with rope burn. His jumpsuit was torn at the collar, exposing his collarbone and the faded tattoo he'd gotten when he was 17. A pair of broken reading glasses lay beside him. I knelt. He stirred, groaned. "Clay," he rasped. "I've got you," I said. He tried to push himself up, but I caught him before he fell. "What happened?" I asked. "Arson. He bolted when the lights went. Said he was going to find help. Left me locked in. 2 others found me in the dark. Thought I had meds in my pocket. I didn't." His voice cracked. "They tried to take it anyway." I helped him to his feet. He leaned heavily on me. I looped one arm around his back, bracing him with my weight, and led him toward the hatch. We moved slowly. He limped. I could feel every muscle in his body trembling. "Maybe you come," he whispered after a minute. "Because I was the closest," I answered. "You could have sent anyone." I didn't respond. "I thought you hated me," he said. "I did," I said. We reached the maintenance stairwell. Harvell's voice came through the static on my radio. "Warden? Sir? Do you copy?" "Alive. En route. Prep med bay," I answered. By the time we reached the upper block, the power had been partially restored. Emergency lights flickered back to life. 2 guards met us at the junction. I handed Alex off, instructing them to escort him without cuffs. Harvell raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He knew better. Later that night, after the building had quieted and the inmates had been secured, I returned to the infirmary. Alex lay on a cot in the corner, a bandage on his head, an IV in his arm. The nurse stepped aside when I approached. He looked up at me, eyes hollow but clear. "Thanks," he said simply. I nodded. He shifted slightly. "You didn't have to come down there. You could have left me." "I don't leave people behind," I said. "No," he murmured, "you don't." There was a long pause. "I was 16, he said. "The night I stole the bond check. Remember that?" I said nothing. "You were at training camp. Dad had just died. I told Mom I needed gas money, but I was lying. I cashed it. Lost most of it playing poker behind the gas station with Donnie and the rest. Thought I could double it and give it back before anyone noticed." He closed his eyes, but I didn't. "And when the money was gone and the fear hit me, I forged the withdrawal slip in your name. Told Mom you did it when you came home." I stared at him, my hands clenched at my sides. "She didn't believe me at first," he continued. "But I cried. Made a scene. She was grieving, Clay. She wanted a reason. You didn't argue. You just stood there." I remembered. "I waited for you to hit me," he said. "To yell, to prove I was wrong, but you didn't. I made a promise," I said, "to protect you, even from yourself." He laughed, bitter and soft. "Well, you kept it, even when I didn't deserve it." He looked up at the ceiling. "Why? After everything I did, why?" I didn't have an answer, not one he'd understand. So I said the only truth that mattered. "Because I remember the boy you used to be, and I wasn't ready to bury him yet." He didn't speak after that. His breathing slowed. He drifted into sleep, the kind that comes not from exhaustion, but surrender. I stood there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his chest, remembering all the things we never said, all the years lost in silence, all the wounds we carved and carried. Outside, the storm had passed. The sky was breaking open, the first hints of dawn stretching pale and uncertain over the horizon. I walked back to my office, sat down at my desk and pulled out the resignation form. My name looked strange scrawled across the line. Lighter. Somehow, the war was over. Not won, not lost. Just over, and for the first time in a decade, I allowed myself to breathe. I submitted the resignation 2 days later. No fanfare, no speeches. Just a sealed envelope on the deputy warden's desk, stamped with the date and signed in blue ink. I didn't wait for them to process it. I didn't need a ceremony. I'd served long enough to know when a post was no longer mine. The official reasoning was left vague. Personal conflict of interest, sustained exposure to stress, ethical realignment. They accepted it without argument. Maybe they already knew. Maybe Harvell had guessed the truth after the night in the lower wing. Or maybe no one really cared why the warden walked out of his own prison and didn't look back. The papers also included a request to transfer inmate Alexander Bennett to a facility 3 counties south. I marked it urgent, flagged for mental health observation, and appended a short professional note stating that continued proximity between warden and inmate was no longer advisable due to familial association. No names, no stories, just facts. James found me before I left. He stood outside the chapel doors, hands in the pockets of his black slacks, tie loose at the collar. I hadn't told him I was going, but I think he sensed it anyway. "You won't stay for the formal handoff?" he asked. "No need," I said. He nodded slowly. "You did good work here, Clay. A lot of men leave with more anger than they brought in. You kept them human." I didn't answer. He knew that praise made me uneasy. After a moment, he added, "He asked about you this morning." I raised an eyebrow. That he didn't expect you to actually leave. He's not the only one surprised. James smiled, but there was something sad in it. "Did you forgive him?" he asked. "Thought about it?" "No," I said. "But I stopped needing to punish him." That might be close enough. He didn't argue. He offered his hand. I shook it. As I drove out past the outer gate for the last time, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I knew what I'd see. Concrete, steel, a watchtower, and 10 years of echoes fading into the earth behind me. I sold the house within a month. Too many ghosts inside. Too many drawers that still creaked open with folded papers, photo albums I'd tried to forget, shirts that smelled like another decade. I moved 2 counties west, to a town called Elton's Ferry, a speck on the map where the post office doubled as a hardware store and the diner closed at 5. There was a veterans shelter there, run down, underfunded, mostly ignored. A place where men with shadows in their heads sat around card tables and tried to pretend they still had something to give. I started volunteering part-time, fixed the water heater, rewired the fuse box, built a ramp for the back door. No one asked where I came from. They just handed me tools and told me which boards were rotting. It was the kind of work that didn't make the news. Quiet work. Necessary work. Every now and then, a vet would talk about a firefight, a broken marriage, the first night in a tent after their discharge. I didn't offer answers. I wasn't trained in counseling. But I listened. Sometimes that was enough. I slept in a trailer behind the shelter, a borrowed thing with a broken heater and a door that stuck in the frame. I didn't fix it. It reminded me that some things don't have to work perfectly to hold. Winter came early that year. The leaves didn't fall so much as flee. The river froze in patches. The shelter got quieter. Even the broken men found excuses to stay home when the wind blew hard enough to shake the siding. I spent Christmas alone, by choice. One of the staff left me a wrapped tin of gingerbread cookies. I never opened it, just held it for a while, then set it on the counter beside the stove. January was gray, February colder, March brought mud. And then, in April, he came. It was a Sunday. I remember because I had just returned from the farmer's market, carrying a plastic sack of bruised apples and stale bread that the vendor gave me for half price. The wind had picked up, snapping the flag on the shelter's porch. I noticed the car first, a beat-up sedan, dented on one side, paint flaking from the hood. It wasn't familiar, but the figure leaning against it was. Alex stood with his hands in his pockets, head down, shoulders hunched like he'd been standing there a while. His hair was longer, scraped back behind his ears, and he wore a plain jacket 2 sizes too big. He looked thinner. Not sick exactly, just stripped down, as if life had whittled him. I didn't say anything, just walked past him toward the trailer. He called after me, "Clay." I stopped. He took a few steps forward. "I heard you were here." "Who told you?" "James. He sent me a letter. Said you were alive." I turned back slowly. He looked different. Not younger, not older, just quieter. "I'm not here for a scene," he said. I don't know. I wanted to see you." I nodded. He hesitated, then added, "You look good." "Better." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stood there, watching him fidget. "I got out early," he continued. "Behavior credits, counseling. They said I was making progress." "Are you?" He smiled faintly. "Trying. I'm working nights at a print shop. Manager's a hard ass, but he doesn't ask questions, pays cash." I nodded again. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said quickly. "Not a place to stay, not forgiveness. I guess I didn't want to disappear again." There was a long silence. The wind blew. Finally, I stepped aside and gestured toward the bench by the trailer wall. He walked over, sat down slowly, like he wasn't sure if the bench would hold him. I joined him. We didn't speak. 10 minutes passed, maybe 20. We watched the trees sway. A bird landed on the wire above us and chirped once, then flew off. Eventually he said, "You ever think about Mom?" "All the time." "Me too." More silence. Then he asked, "Do you ever think it could have gone different?" I breathed in. "Every day," I said. Another pause. "I'm sorry," he said, barely a whisper. I didn't look at him. "I know," I answered. He didn't cry. Neither did I. That wasn't us. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't offer a hug, just nodded. "I might come by again sometime, if that's okay." I shrugged. "This bench is not going anywhere." He smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't showy, but it was real. Then he walked back to his car, started the engine, and pulled onto the road. I watched until he disappeared past the trees. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the horizon. The light was changing, dusk creeping in like it always did, soft, slow, steady. The world turning without fanfare. There was no victory in any of it. No neat ribbon to tie the past together, no speeches or reconciliations. Just two men who had finally run out of things to destroy. I stayed on the bench until the stars came out. And for the first time in years, I felt something settle inside me. Not joy, not even peace. Just a silence that didn't hurt. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful tales just like this one. Watch the next video for another unforgettable journey, and don't forget to share this with someone who needs to hear it.